I'm Yu Ying Song. I'm currently an associate professor in the Human Services Department at California State University, Fullerton, training primarily undergraduate students, many of whom wanted to be social workers and marriage family therapists. And Rod and I will talk about models of supervision today. Rod, I know this might be an obvious question, but why is today's topic important?
Theories or models, we're going to use the terms interchangeably, help us understand what to look for and then what to do about what we're seeing. As Kurt Levine is so famously quoted as having said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. When Janine and I covered models in our book, we organized them in three types. The first type concerns models grounded in psychotherapy theory. Till a couple of decades ago, these were the models of supervision, just direct extrapolations of models of therapy. So psychodynamic models informed psychodynamic supervision, humanistic, CBT, and so on. Those were developed in a therapy context and not in an educational context. And yet they inform a lot of what we do. So the psychodynamic model has brought us parallel processes that we've talked about. And we've certainly spent a lot of time on working alliances, which also came out of the psychodynamic literature. The CBT folks have also focused a lot on supervision. And in some ways, they've foreshadowed a competency-based approach in that they're really focusing on skills and measuring those skills and adherence to them. As a matter of fact, one of the characteristics of a CBT approach often is fidelity checks. That is, how close is the supervisee adhering to the model? And that has some limitations in that the focus can be overly on skills. Another category of models is the developmental models. And these speak to how supervisees change across time and how supervisors respond differentially according to their developmental stage. And we're going to speak later to Brian McNeil, who's one of the originators of the integrative developmental model. And he's going to really help us understand that approach. And then the third category are models that speak to the supervision process. And we've already talked earlier in this term, for example, about the critical events and supervision model of Ladani, Friedlander, and Nelson. We talked about it, for example, when we talked about countertransference and attending to marker events and how to play it out after that and so on. What we're going to focus on today, though, is the discrimination model. And later, we're going to interview Janine Bernard, who's the originator of that model.
So there's so many different models of supervisions or theories of supervision, but we didn't really see or hear any mention of a competency model, which is what this course is about. How does that fit into what we're discussing today?
A competency-based approach is really a meta model. It really is encompassing all of these. So as you point out, we've been covering the competency-based approach throughout this course. It's what the course is about. And so each of these could fit within it. So what characterizes it are things like having articulated particular behaviors that you're going to work on with the supervisee. That's why we've spent so much time on supervision contracts, focusing on feedback and training. And competency-based approach speaks to various kinds of competencies, relational, and so on. And then, of course, the all-important aspects of assessment and, again, feedback. So it is the meta model under which all of these could fit.
But we only have half an hour. So what would you recommend that we really pay attention to in the next half an hour or so?
We've prevailed upon Brian McNeil, one of the authors of the Integrated Developmental Model, who's going to speak to us about what that model's about, and Janine Bernard, who's the originator of the discrimination model. We're just very fortunate to have the originators of those theories. They've agreed to keep this as kind of an elevator speech, their model in 10 minutes. So that's what's going to follow. You know, it's a real pleasure to be able to bring Brian McNeil to us today. Al Stoltenberg developed the first version of what's now the Integrated Developmental Model in 1981, which is almost 40 years ago. Brian, you've been working with him for about 30 of those years, though. So clearly the expert now on integrated developmental models. So maybe you could start off by telling us what it is.
The integrated developmental model builds off of Cal Stoltenberg's 1981 model, which he called the counselor complexity model. We went through different variations, building from that original model in a couple of books. At this point, the model consists of, three developmental levels, which kind of coincide with beginner counselor trainees, intermediate trainees, and advanced trainees. We look at, sort of three overriding structures through each of the developmental levels. So within those developmental levels, we examine self-awareness or self and other awareness. We look at issues of motivation on the part of trainees. And then we also look at their level of dependency on the supervisor as they progress through those levels to stages of, independent thinking, conceptualizing, independent psychotherapy skills. And then we look at these levels and structures in a number of domains: assessment, counseling skills. Someone could be a level 1 in terms of, let's say basic counseling interventions. And, maybe if they came in with a specialty or experience or expertise in assessment, they could be a little bit higher in that domain.
So let's just start with the level 1.
Okay.
What would that person look like? And what does that mean for the supervisor?
A level 1 individual is someone with basically no skills, very little training. Usually, typically, they're seeing clients for the first time. So I would encourage everybody to kind of think back to the first time or the first client that you saw. You were probably a bit anxious. You were probably very focused on what you were going to do in that session. In other words, what am I supposed to do? What has my supervisor told me? What do the theories, state? So very much self-focused and very much dependent upon your supervisor to give you some direction and structure for those early sessions. We're looking at, first semester of supervised practicum.
What's a level 2 person look like then? And what are the implications for the supervisor?
The level 2 person, and this might coincide with a person's third or fourth semester of practicum. They've got some experience at this point. They've had some successes as well as some failures, the psychotherapy process. They are hopefully, with good supervision, growing, getting better. So they're better able to appreciate that complexity that goes into counseling or psychotherapy. And at the same time, they're starting to question some of their skills, perhaps. The beginner is highly motivated. You can give them any kind of homework assignment and, they'll bring you back 3 more books, that they're reading. The intermediate person they get their, world a little shaken up. So sometimes their motivation can fluctuate, okay? They wonder why they're successful with some clients and not so successful with others. At the same time, as I mentioned, they're growing in their abilities, their skills, their level of self-awareness. So they're starting to function more independently. But at the same time, they still are dependent upon their supervisor for some direction. So typically what they're experiencing is sort of a dependency autonomy conflict. So this might cause some conflicts, kind of as the adolescent is acting out, establishing their own independence. And so the supervisor needs to recognize that and be able to steer them towards independence, but not allow them to get too overconfident where they believe they sort of know it all already.
We've talked a lot in this course about rupture repair processes. So I'm imagining then at this intermediate level, that would be a particular concern. Like there's going to be that kind of tension back and forth, kind of a struggle for the supervisor to address those relational issues?
For intermediate trainees, the research suggests that they're asking for more intermediate kinds of training and skills intervention. And a lot of times this can be around issues of transference, countertransference, processing in the moment with their clients. They want to know more about those things because those are more advanced level skills. And I think a good way to attend to that supervisory relationship is focusing in on that kind of processing between the supervisor and the supervisee. And I believe the advantages there is that, that's sort of a in the moment kind of intervention that you can demonstrate with them that then illustrates what they could be doing with their clients as well. And I think trainees respond very well to those kind of in the moment, honest types of conversations, even though they might be a little difficult at times.
And then the third level. So what does the person look like and the supervisory implications?
At level 3, we like to say that the trainee has sort of weathered the storm, and the supervisor, by the way. And if that's occurred successfully, we see a level trainee with highly developed skills. They show a lot of self-awareness in terms of being able to accurately talk about and be aware of their own strengths and weaknesses. Motivation becomes very high again, and they're functioning as psychotherapists on a pretty independent level across the various domains. If anything, they can identify a domain where perhaps they need a little bit more work. And so shoring up those domains is pretty common for most supervisors with a level 3 individual. And this probably coincides, I would say, typically with the end of a predoctoral internship or with master's folks going into maybe their first placement where they're still receiving some supervision. In other words, I think that having an opportunity full-time to engage in clinical practice really kind of brings everything together for someone. You're not in graduate school, you're not having to go see 3 clients and then go back and finish a project and then go to class later. So I really feel like that full-time kind of immersion allows someone to hone their skills and then put things really together for their practice.
The folks who are in our supervision course are supervising a range of people, certainly practicum students, but most of them are supervising people with master's degrees in social work or marriage and family therapy or counseling who are licensure. And so do you have any advice for them?
As a supervisor, maybe you see some areas or domains where they might be limited. If you approach it too strongly, I think then you might elicit some defensiveness in an advanced trainee. So I think you have to be very careful. And an old friend of mine, and yours, Rod, once told me, when working with these kinds of individuals, the best thing you can do is give back some credibility. In other words, do a thorough assessment and respect them for the skills that they bring. We see our model as being really atheoretical or meta-theoretical in that within this model, you could work with, whatever is your preferred orientation.
Is there anything I should have asked you about that I didn't?
Oh, maybe the only thing I can think of, Rod, is that, the model is really predicated on accurately assessing your trainee and what is their developmental level, and being flexible enough as a supervisor to provide the appropriate kind of supervisory environment with your interventions that are gonna not only attend to their issues, but also help them to achieve those higher developmental levels.
Thank you so much. I know the people in our class are going to be just really thrilled to have the expert in the integrative developmental model giving us this overview.
Well, thanks for having me, Rod. I'm happy to do this.
Now let's take a few minutes as a group to talk about supervisees you have had recently. Specifically, think about the different dimensions that Dr. Manil has presented: autonomy, self-awareness, and motivation dimensions. Think about where you would put your supervisees on these dimensions and share the evidences that you're using to do these analyses.
I'm delighted today that we have Janine Bernard with us. Janine developed the discrimination model in a publication that came out in 1979. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And in that period, it's really become one of the more dominant models. So in a nutshell, what is the discrimination model?
First, I need to say, I think its longevity is really because of its simplicity. Although I think you certainly can see a lot in it if you use it correctly. It's really just meant to help the supervisor ground him or herself in terms of both what they're attending to and then what to do with what they're attending to. And that's it. It was never meant to direct the supervisor into any particular theoretical camp, or, it is only as good as the person using it. It's had a lot of adaptations over the years. In terms of using it for multicultural supervision, using it in the medical field, using it for spirituality. It's interesting. I was informed that there's an article coming out in a regional journal using it now to help the supervisee with shame resilience. So again, the model can be adapted to a lot of things. So what is it? When I first began to teach supervision, I was aware that I needed to help my supervisors know what to look for. They were so new to the responsibility of supervision. I found that if anything, they were attracted to the plot. They were listening to the story of the client, as opposed to having a way to pull back and start looking at the supervisee. So I divided what I think counseling entails into what we do, what we think, and how we as people interact with those two. And that became the three areas of focus. So I encourage supervisors to look at the overt behaviors that they see in the counselor. What are they doing? How well are they doing it? Do they seem to be as comfortable challenging a client as they are supporting that client? Do they ask good questions? Do they remember to reflect what the client says as opposed to asking one question after another, etc. And these intervention skills span from very rudimentary skills to expert interventions. So those are the easiest to pick up if you're a supervisor, because they are in fact overt. The next area are what we call conceptual skills, and that covers everything from the big issues of having a treatment plan that's appropriate for the client, directing the session in a way that's helpful, knowing where you are in the session, making decisions in a session to go one way or another. So all of those things are going on for the counselor as well. And what is the supervisor picking up that they think is the plan of the counselor? Choosing an intervention is a conceptual skill. Implementing it is an intervention skill. And so the supervision issue could be either, pretty much not both. And then finally, the personalization category has everything to do with what's going on for the counselor internally, how their personality is interacting with their role as counselor, their sense of humor, any triggers they might have with what the client's talking about, their cultural sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three focus areas.
Those are the things you focus on then. So
Right.
What you also talk about roles. What are they?
Correct. I'm always fascinated that supervisors are very attracted to the roles, and they spend a lot of time thinking about what role they're in. And there are three roles as well as three areas of focus. I actually think that's the lesser half of the model. I think knowing what the focus should be is so much more important than figuring out if you're a teacher or a consultant. So let me go through the three roles. If I were to publish the model today, that I would use slightly different words than those I used when I did publish it. Instead of teacher, I would use instructor, because I think That's a little bit more generic and gets at the same thing. But what is known as the teacher role is any time that the supervisor is being directive, when they're giving feedback, when they're structuring supervision, when they're giving support to what the counselor did, all the good job kind of things, when they model things for counselors, all of that puts them in the teacher role, which basically means or communicates that the supervisor is more experienced than the supervisee. They're in a position to be of assistance to them, and they're taking that kind of authority to do so. The consultant role is one where your supervisee, from the supervisor's opinion, the supervisee is able to get to their own conclusions about an issue. Their growth can be more collaborative. If challenged, they could probably come up with what was going on and why and what they might want to do differently. So when the supervisor takes a consultant posture, he or she is basically saying, we can work on this supervision problem together. I'm not the expert. You are in the room. You know what you're doing. You're having a bit of a challenge right now, but I think we can work this through.
We've just covered interpersonal process recall in this course. And I've always thought of Kagan as being kind of a pure version of a consultant's role. Is that your take?
Yes, absolutely. Some see it as more of a counselor role, but I don't. Trying to get the person to reflect on what was going on. And in the counselor role, you really are asking the supervisee to stop and reflect on what's going on for them intrapersonally. And that can interact with how they're reacting to the client, how they're reacting to themselves in the role that they're in. Are they happy with their own performance or not? It can also be asking them to reflect on awkwardness in performing particular interventions possibly, or misgivings about the direction that they're taking, or even misgivings about how they perceive the problem that the client is presenting. So with the counselor role, you're really saying, something's going on there that I think it adds a layer to your counseling. And let's stop for a minute and see if we can figure out what that layer is.
We spent a lot of time in this course emphasizing the ethical issue of veering into therapy with our supervisees. So
absolutely.
Clarify how your notion of a counselor role jibes with that.
Yes. And again, I said earlier, I would change teacher to instructor. I would change counselor to facilitator if I were to publish the model today, because counselor is confusing and it's not meant to be in any way therapy. You're only asking the counselor to look at any personal stuff that has to do with the counseling that they're performing. So for example, if you had a counselor who seemed to be particularly impatient with a client, you would want to know, is there anything about that particular client that is triggering that counselor? Pretty much, countertransference issues. Is there something about the client's problem that made the counselor feel insecure about solving it, and therefore they're rushing, or they're trying to get to some conclusion so that they can move this client on. So all of those things are important. You can't ignore them, but you're not stopping to find out if they have, mother issues, or, if they need to go into therapy. That might be a recommendation of a supervisor, but it would never be the role of the supervisor. The supervisor has 9 choice points. If you have 3 roles and 3 focus areas, you can combine any of those, any role with any focus point. However, I've never claimed that they're used evenly across intersection points, and some certainly are better fits. But I have found that in training supervisors, it's sometimes really helpful for them to think of the other 2 roles than their natural role when they have a particular supervision challenge.
Conceivably, then, supervisee might be wrestling with issues of countertransference. And so the natural fit would be the counselor facilitator role, but you're saying there might be reason then to move into an instructor or teacher role.
Right. For example, you might find a supervisee who just can't seem to challenge anybody. And so, yes, you can talk about how to challenge, model challenging, et cetera, and spend a lot of time there. But the fact might be that this comes from a long history in one's family that you just don't challenge people. You're nice to everybody. And so it would make sense that the facilitator role or the counselor role might help this person break through this pattern more quickly by giving them some insight into what it is about challenging that's so difficult for them. The model is so basic, it's really meta-theoretical. It's just a simple tool, and I think that's why supervisors latch onto it early in their training. I think if they can just get used to looking across these three focus areas, and then they'll develop, probably the roles are more different by theory than the focus areas are.
Thank you so much for your time, Janine. It's that you and I have been working together for a long time. And I think this is the first time we've actually talked about your model.
I know. I think that's true. That's great. Never too late.
Never too late. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Now, let's take another few minutes as a group and talk about supervisees you have had recently. What were some of the markers that let you thought about this is where we should be focusing on with your supervisee? What led you to think about you should focus on intervention skills, conceptual skills, or personalization skills, with the assumption that we know that at some point of the supervision, you will hit all of them. This has really been an excellent review of the two models of supervision. Do you have any final observations to share with everyone, Ron?
Well, I do. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge that there are a number of other models out there, and that, of course, we had only a half hour here, so we did what we could to cover two models pretty well. And we chose models that we thought would have broad utility across all of the work you're doing. The other thing I want to close with is just a reminder that this is a competency-based course. We're teaching the competency-based supervision, and I really hope that you'll find ways to weave what we covered today into your understandings of a competency-based approach.
Thank you very much, Ron.
Okay. Thanks, Yang.